not yet afternoon, so good morning, friends. I was wondering, one of my clients who was a venerable old man told me there are two kinds of dissenters, the congenital dissenter and the conscientious dissenter. So after I put the title of this talk, I was wondering, am I being the congenital, no, I have an opposite view person, or am I really a conscientious objector to some of the things that we think about consumer India? And I'm going to try and stay on the side of being conscientious. So it is really the reality of the Indian consumption story that I want to talk to you about. The story that I see is just as wonderful, and I know right now everybody's not feeling so good about it, but it's just as wonderful and just as spectacular, but for a different set of reasons than the usual stuff you hear about favorable demographics, increasing urbanization, increasing aspiration, role of women, so branded consumption will increase. I think the opportunity is bigger and deeper, has more gain and more pain, and that's the opportunity that I want to showcase for you today. So I will do two things. One is test popular theories with ugly facts. Facts in India, as you know, are very hard to come by. A lot of us are fact-free. I often wonder when I look at income distributions, how on earth did they produce that out of whatever they produced it out of? And so I also want to provide a realistic perspective of the nature of the opportunity. Quantum is one thing, but it's the nature that I think we have to think about. So anyway, in frustration, I've actually set up a not-for-profit think tank on India's consumer economy, which is really looking at households. A lot of the data I will show you is from there. It looks at households, and it starts saying, how are Indian households feeling good? How does our GDP growth of 7 or 6 or 9 or 4, whatever we get hyper or sad about, how does that really translate into how households are feeling? How does India earn, spend, save, live, think? Some of it. To begin with, I think we must put the elephant in the room. Indians are a lot poorer than we would like them to be. I think we keep trying very hard to sort of say, if I look at target markets that a lot of companies define, I kind of think that if that's truly your target market, then you should not be selling anything to anybody because it's just the tip of the iceberg. So if you work backwards from total disposable income of Indian households, to the extent that what the government says is a fact, it's a fact. And this is the value at 2013-14 prices. And given a certain set of GDP growths between 6.5 to 7.5, we have the ends of what the total disposable income net of taxes of Indian households is. Now, for those who are not familiar with lakhs and crores, I will provide some numbers. Then we said, let's look at it by slice. I think we should just forget about aspirers and strivers and all these fancy labels that we attach to everybody and say, what is the top 5% of India actually earning? We don't care what label you give them. We don't care. They're way below global standards anyway. So the top 5% of India is 16 million households. At 2013-14 prices, it earned an annual income of about $18,500 US dollars. If you look at the top 20% of India, the top 20% of India earns about $11,500 a year, and we expect it will go up to about $13,230 a year or so on. So this is not a lot of money, but if you total up the total money that all these households use, you will get to the final number of what disposable income is, according to all our statistics. So the point of this is what it is. The average income is about 5,850 US. I've taken 65 rupees to a dollar just to be kind on myself and on the Indian consumer. And it will go up to less than 7,500. So that is really what we're talking about. We're talking about a large economy, a large consumption market made up of loads of modest income people. When companies tell you they target social class A, B, C, A and B, they haven't even hit the top 20%. The top 20% is half in rural, half in urban, roughly, give or take 5% here or there, but this is what it is. And I'm saying like it, don't like it, that's the number we work with. It is reflected in car penetration. We should never look at averages in India, where you divide the total number of production by the total number of households, and you get that same number. So if you look at this, the richest 5%, that's the bottom line, 1 out of every 2 households has a car. Maybe they have more than 1 car. And if you go down to below 20%, you will see the steep fall off. We call them Q because everything Q here is a quintile. A quintile is a 20% slab. So the richest, toppest quintile, the richest 20%, 1 in 5 have a car. If you go 1 level below that, it's just 1 in 20 that actually have cars. Of course, we can celebrate auto sales, and we must celebrate auto sales because in India, a small percentage of a large number is a large number. But that is the opportunity for cars amongst rich Indians is more than the opportunity for cars among rich Vietnamese. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at the total Indian opportunity, the motorcycle is more like it, which is the mainstream. But again, if you look at it, they've gone from quintile 5 to quintile 4 to quintile 3 in a nice progression. What makes motorcycles work and cars not? Partly affordability. Partly, as I will show you, most of India is self-employed. Infrastructure is terrible. You need to get around, and this is a productivity tool. So it is possible to have markets which are well penetrated for the right reasons, but the idea that everybody middle class has the car, let's talk about the middle class. Everybody middle class has a car is really all wrong, or is within inches of getting a car. You will also find a very high overlap between car and two-wheelers. In practically most households that have a car also have a two-wheeler. Because consumers are really saying that when I need status, I will use my car or comfort for the family. When I need to run around, I will do the two-wheeler. And so it's this as well as that. So you will have we're like that only situations where rich Indians will buy less affluent, less premium models of two-wheelers, and poor Indians will buy more affluent models of two-wheelers, because if it's the only vehicle you have, you want to signal status. If it's the runaround vehicle that you have, you don't really need to do that. These are just some examples of vignettes which I would encourage you to think about as a frame. I also think that I think we know this instinctively, but sometimes it helps to just look at the numbers and say, this is what it is. The top 20% of Indian households are poorer than the top 20% of households anywhere else. The top 10% of Indian households are nice because they, in themselves, have 2/3 of Brazil's GDP and population, but they have a slightly higher per capita income than the entire average of Brazil. So when we have things where we put, per capita income on one side, global comparisons on the other, when we discuss what happens in various places, I'm saying let's put stratified facts on the table. The other thing that I am often at war with is this idea of the middle class. We say that there is a middle class because then we comfort ourselves that there is a class above and a class below. But actually the middle class in India, if you look at the penetration numbers and where the penetration starts falling off of practically anything that we like people to consume, the middle class is really India's upper class. It's the top 20%. Now, what often stuns me is that with a lot of the top 20% coming into consumption, it already takes an hour to get into Bangalore airport, and it already takes an hour to get into Bombay airport, and it took me a long time to get off the sea link, and we're just so unprepared for our own consumption, and we're so surprised that everyone's flying. But if you look at Indigo prices and how cheap they are, a return trip in Indigo is cheaper than getting your hair permed in a reasonable beauty parlor, not at a high-end one. And so, of course, we're a Friday, Monday culture because we're young. But it is about having the right price and the right supply, but we're still at the top 20 and we're still running out of capacity. So, I think we haven't got our arms around the consumption story yet. But the income growth story, so the middle class, I'm saying, is really the upper class. I'm calling it T20 because we all understand cricket. It's the top 20%. But the income growth story is really the stunning story. Not in absolute numbers, but where the opportunity lies if you really were to get the right price performance point. What is quintile 5 today? As I will show you from this number. Just look at the bottom, 2013, 14, or 2004, 5, 20, 21. Oh, I can see it there. That's right. If you look at that, you will find that what was quintile 3 in 2004, 5, that is the third slab of 20%, middle India, so to speak, is actually quintile 1 in less than 15 years later. So think about this in terms of people and generations. Between the time you were 20 and the time you're 35, you actually have a stunning increase as far as your incomes are concerned. And when you're poorer and your incomes increase by that amount of money, you actually have a step change and a sea change in the life that you live. So quintile 1 between 2004 and 2013, that's the lowest line of Q1. Actually, between 2004 and 14, we've had a rather strange phenomenon where the upper class has grown slower in income terms. The income of the upper class has grown slower than the income of the lower classes. We're now seeing an unwind of that, and everybody is kind of complaining. So if you look at what did Narega do, it did not really put money as much in the hands of people. Divide those many lakh crores by those many lakhs of people who actually got it, and it comes to some 7,500 rupees per household per year. That's not a big deal. You can make more money getting one child educated. But it actually acted as a base rate for labor, and if any of you have farmhouses in villages, you will know that to step into your house, you have to shell out that 150 rupees a day equivalent, which otherwise we would never have paid there. So due to a variety of reasons, you will find that the lowest income groups, the highest income group actually only grew at 2.9%. So why is everyone complaining about consumption? Because the so-called middle class or the upper class from a large base grew very little, so they didn't really see as much change in their lives as the rest of them. Why do companies not feel it? Because most companies don't go below the top 20 unless you take telecom, unless you take certain kinds of FMCG companies. The financial services companies certainly don't bother. The other thing about this chart, other than the growth numbers, is that the middle class is discontinuously higher than 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's why we kind of say the top 20% is where all the action is, because their income levels are much higher. If you take the top 10%, that's D10 is the decile 10, it's even higher. But then, the question really is how many people, how much pain, how much gain, and where do you actually want to focus? While these numbers are in lakh crores, just look at the absolute numbers. I hope they're visible, yeah. So if you take the top 20 heavy consumers and look at the blue bar, the first blue bar, it tells you how much income they actually have. I call them the heavy consumers because they have money and they are consuming. And the next 60% is what is really India. For those of you who read Gulliver's Travels, this is the land of Lilliput. It is small buyers and small suppliers, and that's really how the world is working. They actually, on an aggregate basis, that's the Q2, Q3, Q4 that you saw, the Q1, Q2, Q3 that you saw in the earlier chart. That lot of people, for example, here, whose incomes are fairly close together, taking out Q1 as a dissaver, taking 2, 3, 4, you actually find that they have more income than the top 20%. This is, again, the trick of India's numbers. They have even more expenditure because a lot of the saving comes out of the top 20. The rest of them, in a good year, manage 5, 6% surplus on your households. In a bad year of inflation, you don't even save that much. The bottom 20% are actually dissavers. They spend more than they actually earn. So what this is really telling you is that there's lots of consumption below the middle as well. It's just that it's harder to get your hands on it. But that is the benefit of having mass brands at prices. What we call masstige, etc., are all versions of the top 20%. But if you physically go below that, you find that you get an interesting market as large as the middle class. And then we have theories that say that the middle class is the real consumer. So if you look at all the reports of all consultants, present company included, I guess, we all pretend that below the middle class, there is no consumer. In effect, we are saying that here is the bar of cost for a company, and if the consumer can pole vault up to that level of income, then they're real consumers. If they're not, then they're not our consumers. But as you saw from the previous chart, the total amount of income and expenditure amongst those that we don't believe are real consumers, due to some theory, is actually quite substantial. So who's serving them? So I've often said there are two kinds of Diwalis: the bad Diwali that those of us watching CNBC in our drawing rooms have, and the good Diwali that happens at Crawford Market pavement. And if you go into Crawford Market and if you look at the kind of stuff that comes from China, if you take a look at what your household help is wearing, very, very nice saris, 200 rupees, 250 rupees, 300 rupees. They don't change, they don't repeat them even as often as I repeat mine, and so on. So I think there is a huge consumption opportunity that is not being served by the large companies, and I think we already know that because it's just too hard, give or take 5 exceptions, 4 exceptions, and so on. Also, I think discretionary income, I've been saying this for a while, in the $3 trillion of GDP, in the third decade after liberalization, I think we've got used to seeing disposable incomes go up. Discretionary, I'm saying, outside of what you basically need to live, is actually going to shrink. Why? I think we've been through a period where income growths were high, subsidies were held, we were not paying fully costed anything. I don't know if any of you have looked at your electricity bills of late, but every state has taken up its electricity bills sharply. And even if you are so-called middle class, upper class, and you run 2 air conditioners, your bill is 15, 16, 17,000. Tamil Nadu took up, you obviously don't pay your own electricity bills. Tamil Nadu actually took up its electricity 47% one year. The commercial rates that we're paying, and why should we worry about commercial rates? Because unlike many of you lucky people, the rest of us in India are self-employed. So when you're self-employed, you have to pay your own bills. So electricity, LPG, transport, while the stock market cheers diesel prices going up, for my maid to come from Virar to work and higher income work in South Bombay is actually 100 rupees a day. You need the auto rickshaw, you need the bus, you need the train, you need the bus, and you need the walk, or the shared taxi. So a lot of subsidies are going away. Education now is slowly taking prices up. And as public goods are getting worse and worse, people are entering consumption through private goods. And that's really why we think that the income growths will not be as wonderful once you've paid for all the stuff you need to pay for. Will a few smart cities change the face of how much we pay for transportation? I don't know. I also know that the Delhi Metro, for example, is unaffordable for a lot of people who are below the top 30 or 40%. So your average laborer cannot afford to move from place A to place B at those kinds of prices, and I think that's a reality. So with the explosion, so on the one hand, you have a certain shrinking of discretionary income. On the other hand, you have you have a lot of things to buy. Every time you go, there's more stuff to buy. And the things to buy are actually growing slower than the total income growth that you have. So growth in temptation is greater than growth in income. And that's why I think it's a real choice for whether I'm lower income, beautiful, young, 18 years old. Should I buy the conditioner and shampoo that makes me look good, or should I buy the new cell phone? Should I buy a somewhat okay cell phone with a higher internet package, or should I actually get some other durable? I think the Chroma hoarding 2 years ago said it all at Diwali. It said, buy durables, don't eat sweets, sweets make you fat. And so if you're spending money at Vandana Luthra and everywhere else, I mean, that is a category fight as well. So I think we're seeing, so every time we look at silos within industries, within categories, we say, why aren't they growing? But if you actually look at all the fights and all the adjacencies that there are, I mean, there is a huge category fight happening. As I said, the pathetic access to public goods and the passionate desire for a better life is actually making people want more productivity tools. And productivity will only go up. So if you have a fridge at home, you can go and cook for another 5 houses in the evening because you don't have to come home and cook your own food. So that's really what is also driving things like durables. It's not just the need for flash, but it is about actually living a better life. So durables, education, healthcare, conveyance, communication, water, electricity. We're buying water now, more than we ever bought before. And inverter is really buying you electricity, or a solar lamp is actually buying you electricity. And as long as you have KYC problems in a lot of big cities, because you cannot prove your proof of residence, you can't actually get access to even an electric connection. So that's the pain part. The other myth that we hear is about, this whole rural market. It is true that rural markets are growing, but I also want to draw attention to the fact that there are many, many shades of rural. So when we say the rural market is growing, is it Mahindra Financial's rural? Is it rural as defined by RBI for inclusion? Is it rural as in the state of Tamil Nadu? Or is it rural in the state of Bihar? So rural India actually has half of India's rich and most of India's poor. And so it is true that rural India is doing very well, and it is also true that it is in fairly deep trouble. If you look at the number of households, 190 million households, we've looked at how many are entirely non-agricultural, how many are mixed, and how many are purely agricultural. And as you can see, if you calculate the quantum of income that is dependent on agriculture in rural India as compared to the number of people, because people's always a little bit dodgy, 43% or 44% of the total income of rural India actually comes from agriculture. We've segmented rural into developed rural, emerging rural, based on the district in which it is, and a set of indicators for the development of the district. I'm going to show you some interesting numbers. There is a developed rural, which is 16% of all rural, and that actually behaves like your tier 2 towns. And so when you say the rural market, again, we don't know when companies also report rural markets. I mean, where in this continuum are they actually placing it? If you look at the definition of rural, the definition of rural basically by the census is 1 minus urban. And you are urban if you're a statutory town or if you have 75% of your male population not engaged in agriculture. With more and more people from this statistic diversifying out of agriculture, a village that has 3,999 people, which has diversified out of agriculture, which is related to a nearest town, is one kind of rural. The minute you cross over, but you don't have a statutory body, the Census of India calls them census towns. And census towns, Nielsen tells us, is where things are growing. But census towns are this odd combination where you don't have sanitation and you have a beauty parlor and you have a mall, but you don't have most other things. So I would just say that I'm really making a cause for just a second question when you hear the theory of what's happening with rural India. And so corollary to that is this increased urbanization will drive the world theory has to be handled with care. What do I mean by that? I think the assumption when we use the word urbanization, the assumption is that we're putting people into neat little cities with value-added lifestyles and value-added work, and they will actually make increased income. It will give you economies of scale, and hey, everything's going to go okay. But one is the definitional issues. A lot of urban, where the urbanization growth has occurred, is actually the deruralization because of this agriculture thing, definition. Another part of this is that 25% of urban India lives in slums, notified as slums by the Census of India. Coming as I do from looking at my markets, not your markets, I think that's a great opportunity because there is aspiration. People are living really badly, and yet we don't have, an IKEA for the rich is okay, but an IKEA for the poor really actually works better. And they're not that poor either because you're living in a slum in Bombay because you can't afford to live anywhere else. And so we do Dharavi tourism, but it all has to add up in terms of what we mean by urbanization. So we're actually putting people into bad environments with an ability to earn more. If you walk 10 dogs in Malabar Hill, you will earn 30,000 rupees for 3 hours of work. And there are plenty of guys who do that. If you make rotis in 20 houses, you will earn, in 10 houses, you will, in one evening, do exactly the same amount of money, and so on and so forth. So what we're actually doing is creating new sets of clusters with new sets of problems, and those problems actually have to get solved, and that's what we mean by urbanization. Urbanization is where if you are not a graduate, not even school educated, but you have get up and go, you can make more money than you can in the village because that is the structure and nature of the city. But it does not mean that everything else works and works brilliantly. We also hear a lot about, the idea of tier 2 towns, etc. It seems to suggest that consumption started at the metro and it trickled down and it trickled down. We make an analogy with China where wherever the investment goes, the income goes and the consumption goes. But actually, some of the tier 2 towns that we're seeing are essentially just the fact that someone got a Tommy Hilfiger franchise and decided to put it in there. When a luxury retailer tells you that I get negotiated every day for what is your best price on the Hilfiger store, you know it's not a luxury business. It is adding certainly to a revenue stream, but it will get replaced by some other fad somewhere else. The long tail of consumption and opportunities everywhere, and that's what makes e-commerce just what the doctors ordered for us. Except that the e-commerce guys have consumer orientation that is so good that they talk about delivering to pin codes. They don't even know where the pin codes are. So they say there are 20,000 pin codes in India and we deliver to 12. But if even someone in one pin code is ordering 2 pieces of something, it's still better and easier to serve than anywhere else. And so that's really the long tail. So if we're discovering consumption elsewhere, it's because we finally reached it and reached it nicely. Okay, this is a... okay, let me explain this chart to you. The last one was supposed to be developed rural, all right. So this chart is saying that if I took everybody living in a metro, are they quintile 5 India? Are they in the top 20% earning bracket of India or the bottom 20% earning bracket of India? So obviously in metros, a lot more people are richer than in what we call boom towns and niche cities. And now, if you look at the lower part, which is the percentage of households and the percentage of income, metros have 7% of households and 12% of income. So yeah, we like the shape of income distribution, but they only have 12% of India's income. If you look at boom towns and niche cities, they have 10% of households and 13% of income. And if you look at developed rural, it has 11% of households and 15% of income. So you have rural actually sitting cheek by jowl with urban and doing pretty well indeed. If you look at rural, if you look at the rest of urban, all those zillion towns we have, which are not very rich, looking at the shape of income distribution, 17% of households come from there, 17% of households, and that's 20% of income. So 20% of income sits in the long tail of the rest of urban, whereas what we saw previously was only 12% of income sits in metros. So I think that's really the point we're making. And then finally, underdeveloped rural is the rural we're looking at, which is really sad. It's roughly half of India, 97 million households out of 270 million households, so a little more, less than half. They have 36% of households, but only 23% of income. So in a sense, we have our own emerging markets, our own developed markets. We have markets which are a good shot for a niche player. We have markets which have a long tail for the e-commerce player. So there is opportunity everywhere, depending on how we look at it. So I think we should just shed orthodoxy. And this rural-urban continuum that we've talked about, which is census towns and so on and so forth, the incomes are now more or less similar. If you take away the top quintile, the top 25% of income earners in urban areas who earn a lot, and the bottom 25% of income earners in rural areas who are pathetically placed. The rest of them is at last a nice middle market that's watching exactly the same things. It is connected well by road and various other connectivities, and at last we have a mass market of scale. So those who say we are rural marketing specialists, I think they should actually unlearn rural marketing and say we now actually truly can harness scale. And this scale is large scale indeed. And a lot of stuff is travelable. We also hear a lot about favorable demographics which will drive consumption. I think the truth is that 50% of young India has really dismal demographics because they come from households that are poor. They come from households that are poor, and we're not creating jobs. Modern manufacturing, for every unit of capital, actually creates less labor. So we have dismal youth incomes. It doesn't mean attitudinally they're not different, but behavior is one thing, structure is yet another. Our occupation demographics is quite pathetic, as I will show you. Most of India does not actually have regular jobs. And yet we don't do credit appraisals, particularly well for them. We don't actually structure life insurance products or other products for them and so on. We have income mobility, we haven't seen social mobility. But the good news is that per 1,000 population, we actually now have more families because family size is shrinking. So if you look at America's population to families, you end up with a number that's so vast, and you say, of course you sell 3 times as many refrigerators to the same population as we do. But now we're beginning to see that effect, particularly in richer urban areas. And those of us who have children who opt to live away from home will know that. Particularly this one is for financial services, which is, 35% of urban households and 13% of rural households are salaried. Meaning you may be formal sector, informal sector. We know that only 6% is employed by a lot of companies that are in the formal sector, 94 informal. Within that, if you say who gets a regular salary and who doesn't, and I don't have time to take you through the income occupation demographics, but all of rural India, for example, is labor, which is agriculture or construction. You have a little bit of agriculturists and a lot of self-employed people in the non-agriculture space, tailors, carpenters, bookkeepers, whatever. So when rural India feels badly as it does now, because construction is going through trouble, and agriculture is also going through trouble, so you get a double whammy. So the idea of a regular household income doesn't work. The good news of this is that when we have a downturn, we don't lose jobs because we don't have jobs to lose, but the entire society takes a proportionate haircut. So the cleaner takes a haircut, the driver takes a haircut, the dhaba owner takes a haircut, the client who serves the dhaba owner takes a haircut, and I take a haircut. So, that's the way it actually works. But digital, I think we should just stop being surprised and asking. It's mainstream. It became mainstream the day our temples went mainstream. So if you can get temple blessings mainstream, and I went in a chat room, I saw something that said, if I cut and paste this mantra 108 times, will I get the same punya, whichever way it translates, the same benefit as if I say it 108 times. So if we say, so the demographics of youth may be dismal, but I think the minute our temples go online, we're absolutely fine. Our astrology has gone online, we're absolutely fine. But, the digital economy is actually perfect for the sharing economy. We've always had a lot of people consuming a little bit each that adds up to a lot. So what were sachets? A lot of people who wash their hair once in a while, regularly, occasionally, with a little bit of shampoo. Now, the digital economy has made that possible with the BMW car. I don't have to own one if I can get an Uber, whatever it is. The other day, my daughter actually I was horrified, ordered a dress that came, and she said, you pay whatever, 3,000 rupees, and you use it for 2 days, and then you can return it, or you keep it for a week and you return it, and if you don't want to use it, it's okay. But why buy 7,000? Well, she said you had to otherwise pay 8,000 rupees, and you may not actually have the courage to wear it wherever you want to go. So that's, again, the sharing economy. I think all the aggregation models that we're seeing are absolutely perfect for our long tail and for a lot of people consuming a little bit each. And that's why it's sort of here to stay. And, the aggregators have been able to aggregate what the large companies have not been willing to do. And that's where the consumption explosion is coming from. So if there's something called fizzy goblet that makes a certain kind of chappal, you can decide you want it and buy it. But fizzy goblet would never be able to set up the physical distribution to be able to do this. And logistics has never been a problem with us, right? The CEOs of all FMCG companies on their BlackBerries will get secondary sales every evening, not just primaries, and have been getting it for many years to come. Generation next will be avid consumers, but we have created a generation of monster consumers, which will make it hard for margins to come back up. Why? When Pepperfry advertises that they will deliver something 6 floors up, and if you don't feel like it, they will take it back 6 floors down at no extra cost to you. Suppliers shape consumers as much as consumers shape suppliers. I think a lot of the better for cheaper, as it is after liberalization, we've seen the prices coming down because duties got rolled back and because competition actually came in. So if you think of an air conditioner, think of telecom rates, think of practically everything. And now we're actually seeing the second wave of the same thing happening because of what e-commerce companies are doing. So essentially, you're programming a consumer to say that you can get the best deal, you can get better for cheaper. And so then people say, why are Indian consumers so value conscious? Of course we're value conscious. We want the best at the cheapest price, and we are getting it for a long time to come. So let me sort of quickly wind up. I think the mega opportunity is aspiration for better living when we have no public goods, poor living conditions, rising incomes, need for productivity because we don't have employment, child obsession, and digital comfort. Now, this is actually the potent package. We don't actually need to look at, where on the curve are we of branded consumption versus income increases. And I'm saying this is a mega opportunity of a certain kind for companies that are willing to seize it. Some companies are, some companies aren't. So this is, I think, the new paradigm. The consumer is ready. In my new book, A Never Before World, I have sort of raved and ranted about how many things we actually want, which are important for us, but there is no relevant supply. Including, Hindustan Lever does not give us a mop and a bucket, and we're still, because they only see their job as selling the floor cleaner, and somebody else does on Snapdeal. But there are just loads of things that we could actually get that we don't get. I think we're on the cusp of a huge consumption explosion. We still think middle class. And as I said to you earlier, we should stop being surprised by how it takes 1 hour to get into Bangalore airport and why is everybody flying. Because I think that's really what is actually happening. So thank you for listening so patiently. And if we have time, I'm happy to take questions.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do have time for questions. Can we start with some questions? That was a lot of data in that presentation. Can we get a mic to the gentleman in the front? Once again, sir, could you please stand up, tell us who you are, and ask us a brief question?
My name is Vivek Joshi. I have several questions, but I'll have to restrict myself to one. When you say that discretionary spending is going to go down, and when I look at in the next decade, and when I look at somebody like Patanjali, who's hoping to grow at 30% annual, and part of it is grabbing market share, and part of it is growing the pie, consumption and penetration. How do we reconcile this? What is the definition of discretionary then?
I think it's not the definition of discretionary, it's your expectation of Patanjali. If you grow at 30% versus, I think the question is, if you look at how much we spend on telecom totally, and how much we spend on telephones totally, and if you look at that versus will I actually buy a more expensive thing, I think it's fairly clear. Patanjali is saying I will give you better for cheaper. And that has to be proven. So anybody who gives you better for cheaper. So discretionary is basically once I have paid for my house, my water, my electricity, my rents, and whatever, my child's school fees, etc., whatever I have left. My point is that pool is shrinking. And so Patanjali will fight very hard, and soon the others will fight back, and as will all the other guys fight, and Patanjali will compete with a bigger television or EMIs on a car. But his growing at 30% is fair enough.
Yeah, this is Atul Mehra from Motilal Oswal. Motilal Oswal Asset Management. Just with this entire, in terms of mix of aspiration and discretionary spend and all of that, given that, like you pointed in your presentation as well, the social security is very, very poor. And with people being more aspirational, they're always consuming more goods. Either they want it or they don't want it. So in this era, how do you see something like financial savings really shaping out? Because people are buying stuff on EMIs, and they're buying stuff they don't need as well. So how does the social security bit get resolved in any manner?
So firstly, if you look at saving data, you will find the rich save. Below the top 20, 93% of surplus income is in the top 2 quintiles, 87% in the top quintile. So basically, the rich have surplus income, the rest have expenditure without surplus income. So your savings are coming from one place, your spending is coming from a lot more places. Are people going to actually be making it a point to save more? I think partly we have a lot of financial misoptimism. We're fairly karmic people. I think that a lot of us don't actually plan the way we plan. And part of it is also the problem, we don't have enough life insurance because if you have to have a policy where you pay regularly at a particular time in a year and your incomes are not regular, a lot of people are dropping out because of that. Look at the lapsation profits of LIC, I mean, they're like huge, right? So I think that there is no social security, but I think we're going to see a redistribution of income. We have seen for 10 years a redistribution of income. If you have your, for example, domestic staff, the new bill that's coming up, which gives you a minimum salary of 15,000 a month, you'll see more redistribution coming.
Any more questions? Yes, gentleman in the second row. Sir, can I give the person behind you a chance and come back to you after that?
My name is Vikram Bajaj. I'm from Amrit Kaur. A great presentation and a lot of data out there. I was really struggling to keep up with it because there's just so much information. Is it possible to get a copy of this presentation somewhere?
This presentation, actually contact us at www.ice360.in.
All right. Thank you.
That's a good sales pitch there. Yeah, go ahead. No, it's Mike's yours.
I get one more opportunity. Madam, you have compared India to China and Brazil. But if I look at both our D9 to D1 and Gini's coefficient movement, India has done far better than Brazil and China in their growth momentum. So even though on PPP basis, we may be only around $5,000 per annum, don't you think this is a much more stronger and viable growth story on a long-term basis?
It depends on who's looking. I think if a lot of people who are interested in the stock market are looking, then they're getting frustrated because the creamy layer is not creamy enough. If you ask me to look at it, for example, even this redistribution of income, where the top quintile grows at 2 and the bottom at 9, if you look at it as a policy maker, then you feel that's fine. If you look at it as a business person who's playing the premium game, does not like low margin, high volume businesses because you take a long time to make money, you will complain. So I think it's really who's India and which India are you betting on and for whom. So if we look at it, I think if we look at it from policymakers' perspectives, even if you look at our rural to urban income ratios, China's is increasing and much higher. Our rural to urban income ratios are lower. But then if you're an urban marketer and you want to do modern trade and so on and so forth, it's a bit of a pain in the ass to make money from there.
Yes. We'll just get a mic to you. Just give us a second. It's coming. Mic's coming.
Yeah, hi. This is Pulkit Singhal from Motilal Oswal Asset Management. I think there are quite a few references you made to the airlines. Just wanted to check. So we have around 375 crore rail passengers, that is non-suburban, and roughly only 10 crore airlines. So given your sense of where the incomes are and where the ticket prices are, et cetera, what do you think would happen over the next 10 years?
And India's never either or. I pick airlines because I think that in most of our heads, and this is a session about the mythology we have and whether it's true or not, in most of our heads, air travel, middle class, young people, growing incomes, they all add up. And when we see us having trouble getting in and out of airports, we think that we've already sort of captured a lot of the demand there is. But we have to look at it also with respect to prices, is the point I was making. And I mean, I think it's a no-brainer. If I can fly at an affordable price, in fact, air tickets will come out of, to the previous gentleman, will come out of the rest of the stuff you want to buy as well. So Patanjali will compete with air tickets. So if you have a kid who lives somewhere else and wants to come every weekend, he can't do trains. But trains are okay for a lot of people who've never been on trains before and never left where they are.
Okay, I have a question, Rama. Half your presentation makes me feel optimistic, and the other half depresses me. At the end of the presentation, should I be optimistic or pessimistic about the Indian growth story?
And I think that is the important question, which is it depends on whose lenses and what lenses you're looking through. And that's the point, of this all, that, let's not have a brush that paints it all. You should be optimistic about it. As far as consumption-driven economies go, you should be pessimistic about it if you are in any of the consumer goods businesses, because China is basically eating your lunch and where the opportunity is. And there is greed and there is fear. So from a greed point of view, you should feel really bad. From a satisfied with what I'm getting, where I'm getting, then it's all right.
I have a follow-up moral question. If I were to summarize your presentation into 3 sentences, the rich are getting richer, the middle class is getting slightly richer, and the poor are getting poorer. Is this going to present moral problems for us? Am I right in my summary?
No, you're not right in your summary. I'm saying the poor are getting less poor faster than the rich are getting richer.
Okay. That's a compound sentence.
Yeah, because the poor are getting less poor. It's just that they're still not rich enough for us, given who we believe is a real consumer. And I think that's the point. You know, the dharma of business is to solve the problems of the guy who's there. It's not to wait for him to grow up into some notion of something that you actually like. Will it create social problems? We're already seeing everything. In fact, what is this, should he reduce interest rates or not? The growth versus inflation debate is a rich versus poor debate. Right? And who benefits from EMIs going up and who benefits from earning a better interest on your deposits? It is a rich versus poor debate. So I think we're already there, aren't we?
Another phrase you mentioned is the IKEA for the poor. Why is it so hard? Now, IKEA is already IKEA for the poor in other countries. It's not IKEA for the rich. You serve on the boards of multiple consumer-facing companies. Why is it so hard for large companies to service the interests of people below the top 20%?
Because you have to have, they can only pay so much. You have to give them this. They're monster consumers. They have high aspirations and low income. So if you give them rubbish that falls apart, they will get Bharat Bhai to do it. And they basically, and large companies are not used to operating razor-thin margin, high-volume businesses. Right? It took Hindustan Lever 10 or 15 years to acknowledge Nirma. Right? We still keep saying, you know, if you read every consultant's report, it tells you that this is the size of India's consumer base, which is some number which is the tip of the iceberg. So why is it hard? It's partly mindset, it's partly cost positions, it's partly, why do I have to do all this hard work when that upper income is growing at such a nice rate? You know, the market rewards me, life is good. So why should I, and I think that's irrelevant. If I were to advise a company, I would say make up your mind, but get your head, your heart, and your purse in alignment.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. Anybody else? From the back, I have one or two more questions, but before that. If the government were to embark on a massive public spending campaign in infrastructure, how does this alter the demographics and the income distribution that you talked about? If we took on something like the Interstate Highway Program, for instance.
Well, for a start, we would stop complaining about rural slowdowns because a lot of rural occupation is construction labor. Secondly, if you actually saw people, it would actually boost incomes because your footprint is much wider. But the question is whether you have the money to do that or you don't have the money to do that. Yeah, it would be good. We've already seen it. We've seen it from the Golden Quadrilateral. We've seen it from how now the rise of census towns. Those are all in relation to roads.
Another phrase that you use, Rama, is that the growth in temptation is greater than the growth in income. Eventually, what is this going to lead to?
It's going to lead to category wars. It's going to lead to people whose business...
What does that mean? What does a category war mean? Can you break it down for us?
Category war means that if you say, I'm in the detergent business and let's look at detergent growths and detergent growths are up or detergent growths are down, you will never notice that literally Patanjali noodles is eating your detergent growth. Or you will not notice that it is a new installment scheme from Chroma that is actually eating into your growth. So what I mean by category wars is that it is now the fight for the wallet in the truest sense. And who's competing with whom is itself something that companies need to figure out and analysts need to figure out.
Okay, that sums it up. Any last minute? Okay, one final question. We want you to keep it brief, sir.
Oh no, you should actually take me out to dinner and ask me all the questions.
Yeah. My lucky day, I get to ask all my questions. This digitization process, how do you think marketers should cope with the risk to brand relevance, this continuous digitization which is happening? What should they do?
You know, a lot of stuff that seems like a theory is actually supplier conduct, right? Right now, in terms of e-commerce, we have Crawford Market on the net, which is the two big boys. And we have a lot of small people who are doing what they're doing. We don't have brands yet. I mean, the smaller guys do have brands, but we've not actually seen a branded play. Like we haven't seen in physical retail. Their dirty little secret is that they think merchandise and format is equal to brand, right? But we haven't actually seen that, and we don't need to see that for a while. So if you take all of Crawford Market, which for those of you who are not from Bombay, every gully has a different set of things, and you take all that and you put it on the net, you got a Flipkart. So eventually, when someone starts feeling the pressure of competition enough to start saying that I'm going to actually start building a brand. And what is a brand? A brand is something with a clear proposition. It's not saying, here I am by me. And when that happens, so it's not the poor consumer's fault. I think if the supplier is saying that I'm just going to do a Crawford Market on the net play, the consumer is saying, good for me. So I think we have to see our supplier conduct has not needed to be as great as it needs to be. Sometimes your bottom line grows, sometimes your top line grows, and your market cap keeps growing.
All right, I'm sorry to intervene, but that's all we have time for. Rama, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.